Welcome to video 2 of the Mastering the Nerves course. In the last video we laid the groundwork for what's to come, highlighting the ancient tendency of our minds to keep us safe, and also I guess looked a little bit at the nature of our minds, introducing the thinking self, that part of us that's just thinking all the time, and the observing self, that part of us that can just notice and observe ourselves and the world around us. In this video, we're going to take stock and consider what we've done so far to try and control our thinking self, our thinking mind, that part of our mind that perhaps drives a lot of our nerves and anxiety in our performance domain. Now, many people have tried many things to control their minds or feelings in order to get rid of their nerves or anxiety. Like Sophie, for example, a 20-year-old tennis player, and she's been working hard, or was working hard over the past few years to qualify onto the tour. She has ambitions of playing on the biggest stages, absolutely loves the sport. However, Sophie struggles when there's big ranking points on the line. That is when she, say, reaches the final of events, and maybe in earlier rounds when she's playing certain players who she says, in her own words, she's got history with. And in those games, she talks about being plagued by worries before the match itself, more critical of herself between rallies, and struggles to refocus on her own game plan and strengths in the break between games. At our first meeting, Sophie described how she'd worked hard to practice relaxation techniques, to try and think positively, remembering past successes, and so on. And she said that whilst they worked sometimes, primarily during, again in her words, the easier games, they hardly ever seemed to work for her when it mattered most. So we spent time looking at all these things Sophie had done to try and get rid of her anxiety, and it was a lot, and it certainly spoke to her desire to succeed. Eventually, though, it dawned on her that perhaps she was going about it the wrong way. You see, as we groundbreakingly discussed in our last session, Sophie, and you, and me, have a brain. And remember, this brain of ours loves to solve problems. It's what it does to try and keep us alive. And it doesn't come up with just one solution. Sometimes our brains can work so hard to solve problems, they can come up with a whole heap of ideas to solve one problem. It, frankly, is a problem-solving machine. It loves solving problems. It's just what our brains do. But the problem that Sophie may have been experiencing was the assumption that her anxiety or nerves itself was actually a problem to be solved or to be removed. So I'll say that again. Sophie felt that her nerves were a problem to be solved, something to be controlled, removed, eradicated, reduced, and whatever. Sure, they were uncomfortable for her. We've all no doubt felt anxious or nervous one way or another in some degree, and in some contexts. It's always pretty uncomfortable, but what if though by treating our nerves as a problem to be solved, removed and controlled, we fall into the trap of assuming that we can actually control our thoughts and our feelings? The trap of believing that if we can just find that magic technique, routine or process out there in the internet kept secret by the world's greatest athletes or in the sports psychology textbooks, then we will overcome our nerves, banishing them to our past and becoming the invincible performer we know we can be. Okay, whilst I'm being tongue-in-cheek, I wonder if that sounds like how you relate to your nerves or feelings of anxiety in your performance domain. Perhaps trying to control them in some way, controlling the thoughts and the feelings that come along when we're feeling anxious and nervous, often to make them go away or at least dim them down to such a tiny factor you barely notice it. But here's the question: does that work for you in the short term and in the long term? In fact, let's try a wee experiment. So hopefully you can see a panda here. And I want you to try really hard not to think of the panda. Do not think of that panda. Do not think about it at all. Control your mind such that you do not think of this panda. In fact, do not think of the panda smoking a breadstick, wearing a sombrero and playing the piano for 20 seconds. Do not think of this image. I wonder what you notice there. Most people fail to not think about this ridiculous panda. The image itself is daft, so your mind is just more likely to latch onto it. But some people cannot think about it, but they maybe have to work a wee bit harder to not think about it. Kind of like Scott with, trying not to think about his anxiety or nerves in the last lecture or the last session. Perhaps you or people who aren't able to not think about the panda will maybe distract themselves by thinking of something else, hoping that the 20 seconds passes quickly before their mind starts thinking again. Something like, I really hope this 20 seconds is up now because I don't want to think about the... And you can see the trap. You get the point, hopefully. The more we try and push something away by trying to control it, the more it can come back and get us. Now, okay, this again is a daft panda, but isn't this the case when we're trying to get rid of our feelings and thoughts of anxiety? Aren't we hoping we'll find a magic technique or distract ourselves enough that our minds won't wander, which they do because their minds, they always analyse, predict, judge and all these other things that minds do. Sometimes helpful, sometimes not. However, if we're trying all the time to control what we think and control what we feel, it's tiring and it's hard work, and often means we can't commit ourselves fully to the task at hand in that moment, which is arguably performing as best as we can given the circumstances. So let's take stock. Let's look at what we do to try and get rid of or control our anxious or nervous thoughts and feelings when we're trying, I guess, to perform or preparing to perform our best. And for this task, you're going to need a pen, a piece of paper, and of course feel free to pause the video as you scramble around the house trying to find these things. And you can see already where we're going to go with this, and this table or slide itself maybe looks more complex than what it actually is. But on your paper there, you're going to make 3 columns, and let's start with the left hand column. And at the top, we're going to write what I've tried. And this is all the techniques, strategies, ideas, and so on that you've tried to get rid of those anxious or nervous thoughts and feelings in your performance domain, whatever those techniques and strategies and ideas may be. So maybe pause the video and fill it in for yourself. You can see there that I've added a few just to get your mind going. But yeah, take a pause for a few minutes and really try to think back across the things you have done before or during anxiety-provoking situations that you hoped would get rid of or at least minimise those nerves or that anxiety. And then in the next column, the middle column at the top, now that you've done that, write short term. And here we're simply going to rate how successful each technique or strategy was at removing or minimising those nerves and anxiety. And let's put it on a scale, say, of 1 to 10. So let's just imagine that 1 is like not successful at all and 10 is very successful. And let's also say that short term is in that moment, during that game or match. So how successful was these techniques at helping you control or minimise your nerves and anxiety in that specific match or tournament or in that moment? Again, you might want to pause the video here as you rate each item on that scale of 1 to 10. 1 being not successful, 10 being very successful. And then finally in the third column at the top, the last column, we'll write long term. And as with the previous column, we're going to rate how successful each of these strategies and techniques was at removing or minimising our nerves or anxiety. Same scale, 1 to 10, 1 being not successful, 10 being very successful. But this time over the long term, and let's take long term as being like over the course of like months and seasons and years, like, you know, really think about the long term. And again, you might want to pause the video as you go through this list. And maybe having completed that task, I wonder, do you notice anything? Now, some people find some things are pretty successful for them over the short and the long term, and I'm definitely not here to say stop doing them. I mean, if it works for you, do it. If it ain't broken, don't fix it. But many people find that some things maybe work for them in the short term, but not much works maybe in the long term. And instead they can feel stuck in a kind of, I guess, stuck loop, going round and round trying to get rid of their nerves or anxiety, but not really getting anywhere. Kind of like Sophie. Some things work sometimes, but they didn't really solve the problem for her over the longer term. Of course, I mean, I suppose the plausible solutions that this thinking self has came up with to try and solve the problem of our nerves, whether we've came up with the idea ourselves, or maybe we've read about it in a book or on a blog, or heard someone else talking about it in our network, in our sport, or on TV. I mean, these are all, I guess, valid strategies, and as I said, sometimes they work. But the single most crucial question is, do they work for you in the moments that matter and over the long term? And for many of us, the fact that these strategies maybe don't work as effectively as we wished or hoped that they would, they keep us stuck in this trap of feeling that we can solve these feelings of nerves and anxiety. As I said, as if we can eradicate or control them. But yet it's almost like reality is then jumping about in our face, wanting us to notice a simple fact of being human. Nerves are not something to be solved. They cannot be outrun. You cannot outrun yourself. But when we cling on maybe to this belief, perhaps over time this strained hope that we can solve and rid ourselves of our nerves as we step into our performance arenas, we inevitably start to become scared of our own shadow, weary, I suppose, of finding ourselves in those moments where we may get anxious, desperate that the negative thoughts and doubts don't turn into an avalanche, that the butterflies don't morph into pterodactyls and our legs don't actually turn into jelly. We become scared of our thoughts and own feelings. And sure, as I said in the previous slide, perhaps there are times when we can sometimes feel less anxious. Great. But being scared of our shadow, of our own thoughts and our own feelings, is hardly the beacon of a resilient performer. So, what if there was another way? One that invites you to consider stepping off the merry-go-round, of trying to control, reduce, eliminate the nerves, off that roller coaster of being at the mercy of the thinking self, believing that we must always get rid of these nerves. And whilst common sense may tell us that it's the right thing to do, again, is it the right thing for you? Does it work for you? In fact, what if the answer isn't in running away from or fighting our own thoughts and feelings, but courageously, I suppose, turning towards them, looking them square in the eye, and then leaving them be? I guess from a position of the observing self. We are not our minds, we are not our thoughts and feelings. And ironically, maybe if we can embody this other way, maybe, just maybe, and paradoxically, the nerves won't have quite the same grip on us as they did previously, and we can still perform at our best despite them. And then to wrap this up maybe in a metaphor, if all you have in your backpack is a shovel, then all you might think you can do with it is dig. But eventually you might dig a hole too big to get out of it. So the same tool though isn't going to get you out. The shovel, you're going to need something else like a ladder or a rope, and if you're using a rope you're probably going to need a friend and so on. But what if the field of sports psychology, as it's maybe largely spoken about in the popular media, has only ever sold you shovels? The promise of imagery scripts and goal setting and relaxation techniques to control nerves and anxiety. And therefore we keep on being stuck in that hole. And I guess my hope is that as we continue on this course, we can start to show and provide you with the first steps of a ladder. So in summary then of this session, we've built on this idea that our minds try and keep us alive, but we also highlighted that they love to solve problems, and often our minds try and solve the problem of feeling nervous or anxious, largely driven because it's so uncomfortable to feel these feelings and of course have the thoughts. But we are also in this session questioning how effective is it actually trying to control our thoughts and feelings. Does it actually work for us? Sometimes it maybe does, but what about in the long term as well? Is it as helpful as what it possibly could be? And therefore, what if there's another way? What if we don't always have to be in a battle or running away from our own shadow? And I guess that is where we're going to go in the next video, when we can maybe start putting on the table some ideas or some other strategies that's less about trying to control what goes on within our own skin, including thoughts and feelings, and more just about, I guess, building the tolerance or the willingness to let things just be within our own minds and also within our bodies.